Hi everyone, welcome to the Handy Philosopher channel. For those of you reading along at home, this is the last of the readings for the year, so it's a big moment to begin it. And what a nice way to finish with the Australian philosopher Peter Singer. Um, so the only one that we'll be studying that is still alive, at least as I record this. I wish you good health, Professor Singer. But um, uh, and probably the world's most famous ethicist going around at the moment. Certainly someone of great influence in the world of philosophy. Someone that I'm certainly proud to say, you know, calls Australia home. And yeah, someone who'll be studied for a very long time. Anyone who I teach, I like to go a little bit fanboy over Peter Singer. I just think it's really cool that someone like him came from Australia, and he still lectures here and that sort of thing. And but not uncontroversial, which we'll touch on a little bit, although there's not a lot of controversy to the argument we'll be looking at. Um, but yeah, so a little bit of background. Firstly, on Singer himself, probably most famous for his work in developing maybe not an entirely new school, but certainly an adjusted form of utilitarianism called preference utilitarianism, which changes the focus of classic utilitarianism from maximizing pleasure and reducing suffering to maximizing preferences and reducing suffering. Um, in this way, really what we need to ask ourselves is, am I limiting the choices of other people in the decisions that I make? And if I am, then am I uh, am I doing this in what Singer would sort of identify as an unfair or immoral way? Uh, so the key thing that we need to understand is that for Singer, we have to treat like preferences equally. Okay, so what that means is, and for the purpose of what we're going to be looking at, my preference to live is equal to every other sentient being's preference to live. I can't say that a human's preference to live, for example, is more valid than an animal's. I can certainly promote my preference to live over another being's preference to live if I'm in a life and death situation. Okay, so if I am, in a fight and it becomes clear that the only way I'm going to be able to survive is to kill the person, so I'm killing someone in self-defense, this is morally permissible because I'm treating like preferences equally. The person trying to kill me wants to continue to live, we assume, and I certainly want to continue to live. We both have an equal preference. It's okay for me to promote mine. But importantly, we can't um, suggest that other people's preferences are not equal to our own when we're talking about the same preference. So, for what we'll be looking at, which is the first world's uh, obligation to the third world, Singer is presenting the idea that the preference of, a sub-Saharan African child to continue to live is equal to the preference of my children's preference to live. And what this means is, from a moral point of view, if I would take an action to save the life of my child, then I should really be willing to do that for the life of a sub-Saharan African child. The simple fact that they're further away from me or that I can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. And if I decide that, well, no, I'm not going to do that, I am, committing a pretty serious error in Singer's eyes of suggesting that simply because, I helped to produce the child or the child is near me, their life is somehow more valuable, that their preference to live is more valid. This is a worrying standard to set, according to Singer. Now, he's been involved in basically every major ethical debate that's been going on in the world really since the 1970s or 60s. And so he's always been at the forefront of the animal rights debate, arguing that if continuing on with Jeremy Bentham's initial argument from utilitarianism, which is it's the important factor is not whether they can speak or whether they can reason, but can they suffer? And if an animal can suffer, it therefore shows, in Singer's eyes at least, preferences, and those preferences have to be honored. Singer has often said that an animal's ability to suffer means that it is equal to mankind in their moral weighting, because if they can suffer, our suffering is not worse or less than theirs, but it means that they need to be considered at the same moral weight. At least, in the same way that I would try to avoid producing suffering in someone else, I should avoid that for an animal as well. Because it's not about whether they're of my species or whether they can communicate with me, whether they're intelligent. The question is, can they suffer? If they can, I should avoid that wherever possible. I won't get too much into the animal rights debate, which is really what put Singer on the map many years ago. Most of his work now is to do with the topic that will be looking at, which is the developed world's obligation to helping the developing world. I'd recommend that you have a search on YouTube for a video called "The Life You Can Save." It was created by a non-for-profit organization that Peter Singer is involved with. It really clearly outlines his reasoning for why the developed world has a obligation to help the developing world. And it's also providing the drowning, what we might call the drowning child analogy, which is going to actually appear in our reading. So I'd recommend having a look at that either before or after this reading. This recording is fine. The analogy isn't presented until the next recording. Or the next section of the reading, really. But yeah, I would highly recommend that. So The Life You Can Save. And if you're interested in getting around Peter Singer's movement for effective altruism, make sure you go to thelifeyoucansave.org as well. It's a really great resource if you're worried about donating to charity because you've got that view that, well, how do we know what impact it's having? How do we know whether this charity is actually using the $100 I give and using as much as they possibly can to help people? Well, thelifeyoucansave.org does all of the hard work for you, and it identifies highly effective charities, and it'll even give you an outline of the type of impact that your donation is going to have on people. So in some cases, you can see just how many lives you're going to save through your donation. So I would recommend heading over to there. And if you do give to charity, at the moment, maybe have a look at that site and think about what charities you're donating to make sure that, if you can only donate $100 a year, if that's all you can afford, then make sure that $100 per year is doing the absolute best it can. But public service announcement aside, for our reading, Singer is using the example of a refugee crisis that took place in the early 70s. So the Bengali people. This occurred after the Pakistani government basically quasi-declared war. It led to sort of a guerrilla warfare between the Pakistani military and the Bengalis. They dragged India into it after a certain point, and eventually led to the development of an independent state for the Bengali people. But during that process, it created 9 million refugees. Now, just because this example is from the 70s and maybe no longer so much an issue, the Bengali people are still not exactly living the life of pleasure and affluence, but it doesn't really matter what scenario you're applying this to. So if you're thinking, oh, weakness here is that this situation's gone by and, the situations we have today aren't the same, they sort of are. And we could easily apply all of Singer's arguments that he's presenting to, say, the Syrian refugee crisis or the continuation of poverty in Africa or Asia. So, yeah, there's plenty of modern examples we could use if you'd like to. So moving on now to the reading. This first part is basically, well, it's the first page of the reading if you've got the reader book with you. It's the first 5 paragraphs of Singer's essay. So what we're going to see is Singer providing the context. He's got a real focus in this section about us needing to understand that what has occurred, so the creation of these 9 million refugees and the situation they now find themselves in, has been because of choices. None of this happened by chance. None of it was destined to happen. Poverty is not inevitable. It continues because of choices that are made by people. And quite often they're not, we're not talking about the choice of, oh, will I allow this child to be born into poverty or not? No one would make the choice. Well, no ethical person would make the choice to allow a child to be born into poverty. It's made in choices that we don't understand have a ripple effect to that end conclusion. And this is what Singer's going to try and highlight for us, that the little choices we make are actually endorsing a world where poverty is continued and arguably, certainly got a lot worse in the 1970s. Statistics are suggesting that we're actually making a lot of headway in global poverty. So it's not all doom and gloom, people. Singer presents the idea that he shows a comparison between the Bengali refugee crisis and the development of the fleet of planes known as the Concorde. So they were decommissioned in the early 2000s. And he presents the idea that the choice that's being made here on how much money is spent on something like the Concorde projects versus the Bengali refugees is actually setting a standard. It's setting a moral standard, which, as Singer points out, as is on the middle point on the slide on the screen here, the moral standard being set is that the British government values supersonic, or a supersonic flight, so flight that's beyond the speed of sound, more than 30 times than the lives of 9 million refugees. So we are 30 times more interested, or we're willing to invest 30 times more in supersonic flight than we are in the lives of 9 million refugees. If this doesn't sit well in your stomach, this is exactly what Singer is trying to highlight for you. He's not, it sounds a little bit weird, but he's not trying to guilt trip you. He's just trying to make you aware that when you make a decision to spend money, then you need to understand all of the potential that money had. Now, he's not advocating, giving up everything and living shirtless and that sort of thing. What we need to do is really think about the money we're spending, particularly frivolous money. The Concorde example is a perfect one. I won't go too much into it now because I'm sure I'll go on about it when we're doing the reading. Singer's going to basically end up saying, this is like the intro to his argument. So he's pretty much going to finish up saying, I'm now going to present a logical argument for why we need to change things. And, if you're a logical person who wishes to be a moral person, then you really should agree. Either find a weakness with the argument or accept the fact that you don't actually want to be a moral person, in which case you kind of give up the right to lecture anyone on any form of morality. But without any further ado, reading books out, highlighters and pens at the ready. So we're looking at Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer, originally published in 1972. So here we go. As I write this in November 1971, people are dying in East Bengal from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. The suffering and death that are occurring there now are not inevitable, not unavoidable in any fatalistic sense of the term. So, Singer here is being very clear that this was not destined to happen. Okay, these refugees were not created because they were always going to become refugees. And this is really important for us applying it today. We think of particularly poverty in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, and we think of it as being so ingrained to that sort of the culture of that entire region that it's something that can't be broken. Singer is trying to highlight to us that this is not inevitable. The next generation does not have to be born into poverty. It is not fate in the fatalistic sense. They're not destined to end up in this state of poverty. This is happening because of choices. Okay. Constant poverty, a cyclone, and a civil war have turned at least 9 million people into destitute refugees. Nevertheless, it is not beyond the capacity of the richer nations to give enough assistance to reduce any further suffering to very small proportions. So Singer's identifying here, the core tenet of utilitarianism, which is to act in a way to reduce suffering. And what he's saying is the richer nations of the world, the developed world, it is well within their financial capacity to reduce this suffering to a very small portion. So he's really tapping into his utilitarian roots here. The decisions and actions of human beings can prevent this kind of suffering. You know, I'd highlight that line, very important. The decisions and actions of human beings can prevent this type of suffering. So, in other words, what Singer is pointing out here is that the issue is not one of capacity. We absolutely have the capacity to solve this problem. There's no question marks about that. Okay. So it's now just a question of choice. Do we want to make the choice to? Unfortunately, human beings have not made the necessary decisions. At the individual level, people have, with very few exceptions, not responded to the situation in any significant way. Generally speaking, people have not given large sums to relief funds. They have not written to their parliamentary representatives demanding increased government assistance. They have not demonstrated in the streets, held symbolic fasts, or done anything else directed towards providing the refugees with the means to satisfy their essential needs. At the government level, no government has given the sort of massive aid that would enable the refugees to survive for more than a few days. Okay, so Singer here has identified that this is not just a problem of the individual, it's also a problem of the governments, because at the moment, neither of those two groups, the individual or the government, has taken the necessary steps. We haven't, well, at that point, they hadn't had this overwhelming wave of charity coming in from individual people who all saw the plight of the Bengali refugees and now wanted to help. The governments of the developed world certainly did not want to or um, uh, didn't take part in helping out, at least in any significant way. And so, the decisions, the choices that are being made by both individuals and governments. And at the moment, they're being made to not assist these people. Britain, for instance, has given rather more than most countries. It has to date given £14,750,000. For comparative purposes, Britain's share of the non-recoverable development costs of the Anglo-French Concord project is already in excess of £275 million. So Singer here is showing you that when we spend money, this is making a choice. At the moment, the British government had spent just under £15 million on helping the Bengali refugee. That was a choice. They'd also spent £275 million on developing supersonic flight. This choice seems worrying. Okay. And on present estimates, the Concorde project will reach £440 million. Did some research on this one, and the end costs of developing the fleet of Concordes, as I said, which were decommissioned in the early 2000s, ended up coming in at over £2 billion. So pretty expensive for something that did exactly what commercial airliners do now, just faster. That's the only difference it made. Okay, it made the transatlantic flight go from about 8 hours to about 3.5. That's it. And on its way, it created a hell of a lot of noise pollution because of sonic booms. But yeah, worrying standards here. And this next line is incredibly important to understand. It really highlights the choice that Singer is arguing is being made here. The implication is that the British government values a supersonic transport more than 30 times as highly as it values the lives of the 9 million refugees. Right, so this is really Singer stepping into his preference utilitarianism. What he's suggesting is the British government has placed the preference to fly to America and back from America really quickly at a 30 times higher rate than they value the lives of 9 million people. Okay, so just let that sink in for a moment. Um, Now, if you presented that to any government in the world, well, apart from maybe the most twisted, um, they would not endorse this sort of thinking. But Singer is trying to get us to understand that through our actions, this is what we're endorsing. Okay, when we make the decision to develop a really fast plane instead of helping refugees, when we didn't need a really fast plane, then we're endorsing a moral standard where it's okay to put, minor preferences like getting to and from a place quickly. It's okay to set that at a higher standard morally than it is the lives of other people. Um, okay, so in Australia, this is happening as well. The government has withdrawn lots of aid from that we used to give to foreign countries, and this is continuing to happen, and it's being used in Australia on things like roads. Now, I'm not saying that roads aren't valuable, but my desire to get from point A to point B faster pales in comparison to the desire for a child in Southeast Asia not to die of malaria. Okay. And Singer's just trying to highlight the choice that we're making. He's trying to make us understand that through our action, this is the choice we're making. Australia is another country which, on a per capita basis, is well up in the aid to Bengal table. Australia's aid, however, amounts to less than 1/12 of the cost of Sydney's new Opera House. So again, what Singer's pointing out here is that the Australian government values a new Opera House in Sydney as being 12 times more valuable than the life of 9 million refugees. Okay. The total amount given from all sources now stands at about £65 million. The estimated cost of keeping the refugees alive for 1 year is £464 million. Okay, so the total amount donated, £65 million, falls £400 million short of being able to keep these refugees alive just for 1 year. This is the scope of the shortage that we're talking about here. Most of the refugees have now been in camps for more than 6 months. The World Bank has said that India needs a minimum of £300 million in assistance from other countries before the end of the year. It seems obvious that assistance on this scale will not be forthcoming. India will be forced to choose between letting the refugees starve or diverting funds from their own development program, which will mean that more of her own people will starve in the future. So Singer is, pointing out here that someone down the line is going to have to make the choice. We can't just ignore this. The problem will not go away. At some point, a choice is going to be made. And if we're going to, or, at the time, if the British government is going to choose to prioritize supersonic flight over helping 9 million people, then that decision will fall to India. India will then be faced with the choice to help these Bengali refugees or to help their own people, who in many cases were poverty stricken. At the footnote that you've got there, you can turn to the end and you'll see that India actually comes up with a third option, which is waging war on behalf of the Bengali people against the Pakistanis to establish an independent state for them, which is achieved, but obviously leads to the death and suffering of lots of people. So again, the problem did not go away. At some point, someone had to make a choice, and there was consequences for that choice. In this case, lots of people died in war. That was the consequence of the choice. So the choice the British government made was to build planes. The choice the Australian government made was to make a new opera house. The choice the Indian government ended up making was to deploy their military. Okay, there were choices made throughout this whole process, and that is, that's sort of the hard truth that we need to accept. Singer is saying. So these are the essential facts about the present situation in Bengal. So far as it concerns us here, there is nothing unique about this situation except its magnitude. So this is important for us reading it, like 40 years since this point, because we need to understand that just because this is a example from the past, it's not that it doesn't relate to our modern world. It relates to basically every refugee or poverty crisis we've got in the modern world still. The important factors are still the same, which is there are people suffering for avoidable, because of rather avoidable issues or avoidable circumstances, and that choices are being made to not avoid these circumstances or not help these people when they really should be. Okay. The Bengal emergency is just the latest and most acute of a series of major emergencies in various parts of the world, arising both from natural and from man-made causes. There are also many parts of the world in which people die from malnutrition and lack of food uh, malnutrition and lack of food independent of any special emergency. I take Bengal as my example only because it is the present concern and because the size of the problem has ensured that we have been given adequate publicity. Neither individuals nor governments can claim to be unaware of what is happening there. So Singer is pointing out here that ignorance is not an excuse for the Bengali refugee issue. If we apply this to the modern world, when we think of everything we know now, and this is maybe one of the good roles of the technological revolution that we've had, we cannot claim ignorance of the suffering and pain of people around the world. If you didn't know that people were living in extreme poverty, then you've really tried hard not to know. Okay, you've gone out of your way to make sure you didn't know about that because it is very present in our media and in our world that there's people who are suffering and dying from preventable causes and that we could be doing something about it. Okay, so an important link to the modern world and our modern issues around poverty and refugees, ignorance is not an excuse. So what are the moral implications of a situation like this? In what follows, I shall argue that the way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme, needs to be altered. So Singer is suggesting a wholesale change to the way that we think about moral decision making in society. The way we do it now is broken. It is wrong. And so it needs to change. The way of life that has come to be, and with it, so this is the other thing that needs to be altered, and with it, the way of life that has come to be taken for granted in our society. So Singer is not saying this will be easy. It will be very hard. But in the same way that we have changed, if we change our moral decision making, we need to be prepared for the change that's going to have to our way of life. If this sounds like it's too difficult, then you need to understand the choice you're making, that you want to have nice things and you feel like your preference to have nice things is of greater moral value than a poor person's preference to live. If this sounds unreasonable, I hope it does. So we need to be willing to change society and, most importantly, change the way that society makes moral decisions. In arguing for this conclusion, I will, of course, I will not, of course, claim to be morally neutral. I shall, however, try to argue for the moral position that I take, so that anyone who accepts certain assumptions to be made explicit will, I hope, accept my conclusion. So that last couple of lines there, Singer's really just saying, I'm now going to present my moral decision-making process in as logical way as I possibly can. It's now up to individuals whether they are going to accept that moral decision-making or not. Okay. And what Singer is saying is really any rational person who accepts the premises or the propositions of his argument must necessarily accept the conclusion or accept the fact that they're not a moral person at all. So that's the first part of the reading. We'll leave it there. The next section, Singer really starts to develop his argument. So it's a great example of laying out an argument in sort of a standard form way, a very Socratic method that Singer is going to use, and a very compelling one as well. So take a minute, go and check out the Life You Can thelifeyoucansave.org, and just see what your money could do to help people around the world. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time for part 2 of Singer. Have a great day. Bye.